Hey again, guys. We're just about to kick off the next talk. We've got a really awesome one. We've got Pavithra. I'm so sorry, Pavithra. I'm going to butcher your surname. She works at Pact. She's a principal quality engineer, and she's going to be talking to you guys today about how to elevate quality with API contract testing. Thanks so much, Pavithra.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. How are you all today? Interested? Exciting? Yeah, I'm also looking forward to it, actually. Yeah, so a little bit about me. Myself, Pavitra. I'm currently working as a principal QA at Westpac. I have a strong background in the test automation space and the quality engineering capabilities. I also specialize in designing and building solution as a platform engineer. So with that, today's topic is all about contract testing. So how many of you actually are widely using the contract testing? Like you have great hands-on experience, or okay. How many of you have not heard about contract testing? At least, yeah, if you are not raising hands for both, that doesn't look right. Okay. Yeah, so let me first start with actually, what is API contract before actually going into the, the testing of it. So assume, you are walking into a restaurant and you want to order a food item. What is the first thing you do? Exactly. So here, the restaurant actually is a provider who is providing the, the food service. And the customer who is going to have a food is basically a customer. And in between, the menu acts as a contract, right? So it's very similar to that in the API world, between the provider and the consumer. The provider is the one who is building the service, who is actually providing the service. And the consumer is a customer who is consuming the service. And the term contract in between acts as understanding between them. So assume he is a developer of the, the building team. So as a developer or a designer, they actually, put out what are the endpoints we have to build, like, all the put, get, post, and things like that, and document in the form of specification called Swagger or the Open API specification. So those are the two icons which I've mentioned there. So the first one is the Swagger, and the second icon is like an Open API. Open API is just a new version of the Swagger. So this is how the Swagger document would look like. You have a set of endpoints which is documented in the left editor, and in the right side it shows what are those endpoints, what is the, the structure of the endpoint. So if I quickly go and show you in the online. Yeah. So this is the actual Swagger sample specification. So if you expand each one of the drop down, you can actually see, these are the set of query parameters. This is how the response model look like. This is how the error response look like, and things like that. So that is what is called as the specification, or you can actually call it as a contract. So in the microservice world, pretty much these three are the typical characters. As I said in the restaurant example, restaurant is a provider, customer is a consumer, and the menu is a contract. It's the same thing here. The team who is building is a provider, customer is consuming that service, and in between the contract is the specification. So when we talk about characters, what is the next thing it comes to your mind? Okay, then in your own world, you are a character, you are a mom, you are a daughter. In a movie, any character you call in, there is a relationship, right? So the next thing which comes in the API world is the dependency relationship. So what is this dependency relationship is all about? So assume I'm, like for example here in between, assume I am a payments API. I belong to a team, payments API. and I'm actually being consumed by 3 different customers in the left hand side. So like mobile application is consuming me, net bank application is consuming me, business banking is consuming me. So that relationship is called consumed by. And in the right hand side, if you see, as a API team, I also depend on some other systems or further downstream system to fetch some of the information. So in this case, say I depend on the the customer profile API. I depend on the accounts API to fetch some information. So that relationship is called depends on. So how you have to understand this is like, so I am a mom for my daughter and I am a daughter for my mom, right? So I'm a single character which plays 2 different roles here. It's similar to that. As a API team, they can either act as a provider, they can also act as a consumer. So it really depends on the context. The reason why I'm explaining all this is because before actually getting into the the testing, we have to understand these basic terminologies. Otherwise, it's really, really hard to understand what contract testing is about. So having said that, now let's get into a scenario. Yeah, somebody told story, right? So let's get into a story. So as a payments API, assume I'm making some changes to that API. And what should be my testing approach? Can someone suggest? Based on your experience, it doesn't have to be exactly correct.
I will try to test the contract first. It should not break.
Okay. Sorry? Okay. Okay. I think the main thing is the impact assessment, right? Because I said I play as a provider, I play as a consumer. So when I make some changes, I have to make sure that I am not breaking my customers. I'm not breaking my consumer. So what happens in the traditional, end-to-end testing approach world? Typically, once the changes are made, we just test our functionality from our end, right? And then we basically send a communication to our customers saying that, okay, I've changed my codes. Can you please do your end-to-end testing or a regression testing, right? So it can typically lead to this big back and forth chain of communications, which in turn can lead to a big chaos. Assume your consumers are typically sitting somewhere else, like because I told mobile application, net bank, and when they test it, if something is broken, as a tester, it is really, really hard for them to understand what is the root cause of that issue. So they raise a defect, it goes to the actual mobile application team, they try to debug, and then they find it, okay, this is not our issue, it is a payments issue. And then they send a defect to that team. It's a lot of back and forth, communication. So this is where actually API contract testing comes into picture to, help you out. Basically, it helps you how to validate, the consumer's impact as and when the provider is making the changes. So when I said as and when the provider is making changes, it's typically starting from, from their local laptop, basically, from their local system. So they make changes to the code, they can immediately run the contract test, and it enables to notify both provider as well as the the consumer at an early stage if there are any breaking issues. So there are 3 different types of contract testing actually. So I'm not going to dive in one specific tool today. I really wanted to make it clear what are the different types of techniques, so you can choose based on what suits better you. So the first one is the provider-driven contract testing. The second one is the consumer-driven contract testing. And the third one is the bidirectional contract testing. So let's go to the first one. So before again I get into the provider-driven contract testing, we have to understand first what is provider-driven contract approach, right? So what is this provider-driven approach? Somebody mentioned that, okay, I make the changes, I test against my specification. That's what exactly it is. So I talked about the Swagger and the Open API specification, right? So the provider basically here, before even start to build anything, the provider here actually defines the complete specification on how it is expected to behave, like what are the structure and things like that. So the provider, the consumers are expected to adhere to that specification, basically. So the provider here got a full control on how it should work, and the consumer is expected to adhere. So that's what is provider-driven contract approach. I'll just pass there. This is a bit technical, okay? And at the end of the session, I'm going to ask some questions and quiz. So make sure you are listening, okay? Yeah. Okay, all clear with provider-driven approach? Sorry? I can't repeat. I mean, yeah, I'm happy to repeat if I get another 15 minutes back. Yeah. Yeah. So that's the provider-driven contract approach. Once again, with this approach, provider is having a full control to define, and consumer is just expected to adhere. So with that approach is where the provider-driven contract testing fits in, really well. So what is this provider-driven contract testing? It could be even a simple Postman script. There are any different ways, but to give you a very simple example, say assume you are using a Postman to test your application. You can just write a simple extra validation there to add in, validate the response against the schema. So when I say schema, the specification which I talked about, right? The response models and what is the data attributes it is returning. I'm not talking the functionality here. I'm not talking about the data here, but the schema, basically the attributes, whether I'm getting the mandatory attributes back, whether that attribute is of a model, array, or is it a type string, or is it a int. So that's what is called schema validation. So as long as you compare that against your response, from your end, when you are doing your functional testing, that pretty much covers the provider-driven contract testing. So these are some of the, examples you can use. Basically, for example, when I talked about the schema validations in that first website, you can get a lot of different variations of language, like with Java, how you can verify, with .NET, how you can verify, Node.js and things like that. So if you are, say, using REST Assure or Karate in your test automation, you can pretty much tie these, schema validations into that framework and make sure you are validating that specification, and that pretty much covers it. So it's not a, very big additional set of work there. And Atlassian has come up with something called Swagger Request Validator. So that what it does is basically, pretty much against both Swagger spec as well as the Open API spec, the response is validated against those specifications. So you don't have to write any custom. So it's like a library which you can add it to your dependency, and that will take care of that. There is also another alternate to it. I'll come to the end. So these are some of the examples. But with this provider-driven approach, there is a bit of limitation, right? So as I mentioned before, the consumer is just expected to adhere. So what does that mean? The consumer has a very, very little, flexibility to influence the provider, saying that, I need this extra attribute, or I need your response to return in a certain way, and things like that. So they got a very little influence there, especially while developing the, the API. And also the consumer impact. So when I say consumer impact, say when the provider is making some changes to their code base or to their contract, right? So it can disrupt the existing consumers in a very big way. So if they just added some extra mandatory attribute, right? Then obviously as a consumer, when I consume that API, it's going to break. So this can be managed by maintaining a different versions of the contract. So today I have a version 1 of the payment API. So tomorrow if I have to introduce some breaking change, I have to introduce a V2 API. Basically version 2 should be introduced. So that is how most of the organizations try to manage that, the consumer impact. But the problem with that is, again, developing that whole version of the API is going to take a lot of time, right? And the consumer has to change from version 1 to version 2, and a lot of testing is being involved. So those are the limitations pretty much you have from the consumer point of view. So that is where this consumer-driven contract testing comes into picture. Once again, this is not an approach, this is a testing. When I talked about provider-driven, the API is developed with a provider-driven approach, okay? But when I'm talking about consumer-driven, it's not an approach, it's basically the testing approach, not the designing approach, okay? So here, if you see in that picture, the provider is still building and setting the contract. The provider is still have a full control of the contract, which is being shared with the consumer at a very early stage. And the consumer understands that contract well, okay? And they write their test based on their contract. When I say they write their test, they could write n number of scenarios. I'll show you some of the examples in the following slide. They could write with like a positive, negative scenarios to make sure that the provider is working according to the consumer expectation. Okay, and then they can notify the provider, basically. They can just write the test, and the provider is the one who actually runs that test. So the consumer is not running the test, the consumer is just setting that expectation to the provider. Basically, when I consume your endpoint in a certain way, I'm expecting you to give me a response in a certain way. So they are setting that expectations. And the provider is the one who are actually running those test cases as and when they make the changes. So let me go a bit more deeply to explain this further. So here I'm using example of Pact. So Pact is an open source tool. It's basically language agnostic. It supports in multiple languages. So Pact supports the consumer-driven contract testing. So the first step here is, as I said, the consumer is writing the test to set that expectation that I'm expecting, to behave in a certain way. So when they are writing the test, they are basically mocking the provider. They are not using the live provider. So that's why, it is a very easy way to define the expectation using a mock, right? And this, they are doing it as part of their unit test. So when I say it is part of unit test, remember, these tests sit inside the API code-based repository. It's not something like, the end-to-end test cases, which is sitting in a separate repository. It is sitting inside the API code repository, and the consumer is writing the unit test, mocking the provider, saying that this is how I'm expecting you to behave. That's the first step. The second step is when the consumer runs that unit test, right? Because it is running against the mock, when it is running, it is just basically, recording those interactions. When I say interactions, it's the set of transactions, like the HTTP methods, the request and the response pair, basically. So when the consumer runs that test, it generates the JSON file, which is nothing but a Pact file. It is also called a contract file. The terms are interchangeable, okay? So the first step, consumer writes the test, mocking the provider. Second step, the consumer runs the test. When the test is run, it generates the JSON document, okay, with set of interactions. Once again, I'll show you that examples in the next slide. And the third step, when the JSON is generated, it gets published to a centralized repository, okay? So the Pact tool suggests you can use something called Pact Broker, wherein you can upload the contract to and download the contract from. But it's actually not mandatory that you have to use Pact Broker, because it's like a additional step to maintain that Pact Broker once again. So in our case, we used Pact, but instead of using a Pact Broker, we just used a centralized artifactory. We already have a centralized JFrog artifactory as a storage repository. So we just reuse the same solution here. So when the file is generated, we just push it to the artifactory. So the fourth step is, so now the contract is available in a centralized place. Now, when the provider is making some changes, the provider can just pull in those consumer test cases. Basically, that is what is called as consumer contract. And they run against the real provider code base. So it can be in their local system, or it can be, against their dev environment or the system test environment or any environment, right? So when the consumer wrote, they wrote against the mock provider. The same test cases, the provider is pulling it and they are running against the real provider. So by doing that, what's happening here is the provider is making sure, okay, my consumer is consuming me in a certain way and I'm 100% sure it is working against my latest changes. If anything breaks there, immediately either provider can fix it or they can notify consumer immediately saying, I'm undergoing this change, so you are expected to change in a XYZ way, right? Is that clear? Cool. So as a fifth step, this is not mandatory, but it is good to definitely have it. So remember the payment API example I showed? As a API, I also depend on certain other systems to fetch the information, right? But I'm changing only my side. I'm changing only the payment API. I'm not changing the accounts or anything, right? So when I'm running the consumer contract test against the live provider, I can also mock my downstream. So in that example, I talked about accounts API, customer API. So I can mock those downstreams. So basically, I am like 100% sure, like if there are any issues in the downstream, I'm not bothered about that right now. So first, I'm making some changes functionally, and from the consumer perspective, it is working fine. So that is what, it is about, like shift left technique, right? Because if you try to run against everything live, then obviously, you will have a lot of data dependencies and complexities comes into picture. So during that time, you can just mock those downstreams and, just run against your live code base of that particular API, what you're making change. So let me show you an example here. This is how the consumer contract test looks like. So this is a Java Pact example, okay? As I said, it's just a unit test. So I have used a JUnit as an example here. And as you can see here, at Pact is just I'm importing the Pact library and using that Pact annotation. Anyone remember what is the first step in the consumer driven? Exactly, yeah. So this is the first place where we are mocking the provider's expectation, okay? So in this case, I'm using a Pact provider builder and I'm saying, setting the state first, given the role ID blah blah exist, okay? I'm saying that I'm trying to hit this provider, but the provider has to have this role ID. That is like a, in a BDD scenario, you say given, right? So that's what it is, just setting that state there. And then it is saying, upon receiving a get method with this particular resource path, I should respond back with 200 and I should respond back with this particular response structure. So basically here what I'm saying is, I'm hitting the provider request of this endpoint and I'm expecting this response. So the consumer is just setting this expectation. And similarly, this is then another example for the same endpoint. The provider can write with different data, right? Like for that, the previous one was a positive scenario. This is a negative scenario. So when I try to fetch with XYZ, then I'm expecting a 400 response. In the previous one, they are expecting a 200 response. In the next one, they are expecting a 400 response. So basically, when you are setting that expectation, the consumer can play around with different set of data because they are just mocking it, right? So they can try to, cover their whole test scenarios by setting those expectations there. Then comes the actual test. So the first two slides, it's just the expectation. This one is the actual test. So as you see here in the third line, I'm using a mock server config, right? And in the second line, I've said Pact test for certain Pact method. So the method which you have written before, for example, the first method which I have written here, you see here the method name is retrieve role details, right? So what I'm saying is when I am running this test, go and map with that retrieve role details method. Basically go and retrieve that mocked response. So inside this test, as you can see, I'm just invoking the provider client, right? There is a my provider client, I've just written the red there. So that is the place where I'm invoking the actual provider client. And when I invoke that, because I have the annotation of the mock server and I have mapped with the Pact method, what it is doing is the Pact is actually spinning up the mock server, okay? And then it is setting up that request response pair, what I have set there. Is that clear? This is what writing the test is about. So when they run this test in local, what happens? So it generates the JSON file. This is what I said, right? When they write the consumer contract test and when they run it, it generates this JSON file, which is nothing but a consumer contract file. So how this JSON file looks like? So the first one, it says with the consumer name, and the next comes the interactions. So these are the interactions. Whatever you have mocked in that mock method, it is just generating those interactions here. So there is a request get method, and this is the response, and these are the headers, and it is saying it has to match with in this particular format. It says I'm expecting a data attribute, and it should have a high ID, it should have a name, and it should be of a particular data type and things like that. So if you have like say 2-3 test cases, basically all those 3 scenarios are recorded here as a interactions. So now this is the file which gets uploaded to the centralized repository, right? So what happens in the provider side now? So the provider has pulled those contract from the repository, centralized repository, and this is how the provider test would look like. The provider test is actually very, very simple compared to the consumer, because the consumer are the one who is setting, different scenarios. But the job of provider is just to, verify those scenarios, okay? So in a before test, what I'm just generally doing is I'm just setting some properties like this is the host name I wanted to hit, this is the port name, and these are my API key secrets. I'm just loading those properties there. I'm not doing anything else. And then I'm basically setting the target in the second method. If you can see, I'm just setting the target, the HTTPS test target, to that particular host name. And the actual test, if you see, it's just a one-liner, context.verify interaction. This is a Pact method, okay? What is this verify interaction does? If there is a consumer contract Pact file exist in that project, it basically tries to replay those interactions. So whatever the consumer has generated as an interaction, this provider test is basically replaying that interaction, and when they are replaying against the host name which has been set. It could be your local instance of your provider. So when developer is making changes, they can just put it as a local instance and run in their local. But when it goes to the CI/CD, the host name basically changes to the live environment. So it runs against the live environment. So when the same test runs against the live, it knows whether, you are breaking the consumer or not. Is that clear? So this is how in CI/CD it looks like. So from the consumer perspective, because it is a unit test as part of build pipeline, we know when they run the build, the unit test cases also runs, right? So those unit test cases runs against the mock and it generates the contract. It gets uploaded to the centralized repository, either a Pact broker or any other repository. And when the provider is making changes and when they are deploying the code, as soon as the deployment is complete, they can trigger the contract testing pipeline, and that pipeline basically pulls those contract and runs against the real service. So this is how the whole CI/CD of the consumer-driven contract testing looks like. Yeah. So the advantages here, because it is all like API driven and it is very easy to write it in the unit test format, writing the consumer test cases would be much, much easier than writing those end to end. Obviously, I'm not saying get rid of end to end, but when the provider is making change, you don't have to run your whole regression instead. Like, this is quite faster and efficient. So the feedback is faster because it is running immediately when the code is getting changed, right? So they don't have to wait until they go to the, the integrated environment, inform the consumer, ask them to do regression and then breaks. The feedback cycle is pretty faster here. So, but remember, this could be suitable only in certain places, not everywhere, right? So suppose your organization or your team has a good control of development for both provider and consumer. For example, when I talk about team, it could be different teams, not the same teams. You have like more than 100 teams who is developing different APIs, but everybody is sitting within your organization, so the communication is easier, and both of them, can contribute to write the consumer contract test and the provider contract test. If you are consuming an API which is external, then that becomes harder, right? So the Pact and the consumer-driven contract actually would be suited in a place where both consumer and provider are sitting within the same organization and both contributes to it. The next comes is the bidirectional contract testing. Okay, so in the bidirectional contract testing, it is all about doing the static contract comparison. So one contract represents the consumer expectation. So even here, consumer can actually create the contract test based on the provider mock, okay? But on the provider side, instead of running against the live code base, what they can do is they can just check whether that consumer contract is a subset of that provider specification. So I showed the provider Swagger specification, right? So that is the whole set of document for the provider as a contract. So when so in bidirectional, what it does is basically it is just comparing the static contract. It is not running against the live code base, but still consumer is generating the test and that gets compared against the contract but not the code base. So if the provider is managing the contract version really well, then this can also go. Like if they are not introducing many breaking changes, this can also fit into there. And other place where it can fit is basically, when you are using a third party or you are, you say suppose if you are a public API or something like that, if you are and you don't know who the consumers are, right? In that case also the bidirectional fits in really well because they don't have to run against the live code base because integrating the CI/CD between different organizations are a bit harder, right? So in that case, they can just go with using the static contract comparison. And for this Pact flow, so Pact flow is like a commercial version of the Pact and they actually, support the bidirectional contract testing. Okay. So we have gone through 3 types: provider-driven, consumer-driven, and the bidirectional contract testing. Is there any alternative to Pact, right? So Pact has actually come like almost 10 years before, but unfortunately, even here the adoption rate is very, very less. And the reason why I find is the understanding of contract testing, I think it's not been really understood. That was the reason why I also, chose this topic. So when I dig further, the alternate to Pact, I have also gone through this one. I have not played around this personally, but I think once I go back, I really wanted to play this back. Wanted to play around. There is something called Specmatic. Okay, the Specmatic is not a consumer-driven contract testing, but still, like, it can auto-generate those test case. It can auto-generate those consumer test, and it can run against the the provider specification. So it sort of supports the bidirectional. At the same time, consumers don't have to write the test cases. The Specmatic automatically generates those tests. As I said, I have not really used this, but I found this really, really interesting, and I think it could be a very good alternate for Pact. So when you go back and try to analyze it, definitely consider this as well. So the takeaway is, pretty much do your research before you actually decide. For example, whether the provider and the consumer are sitting within your organization or are they outside, and sort of understand the concept first. What are the differences between the approach? For example, when you are a provider, and what is your team's approach to design the API? Are they using the provider-driven approach, or are they using a consumer-driven approach, and things like that? So you have to choose the testing technique also based on those approaches. You can even mix and match. As I said, in provider-driven testing, you can still stick with your automation framework and do some custom solutions to integrate and check your contract against the specification. And again, as I said, in the consumer driven, instead of using Pact broker, you can use a different centralized solution. So analyze all those and you can sort of come up with your custom solution as well. Yeah, so now any questions before I go into the quiz mode? Yeah.
Great, well, thank you. You mentioned that it's been around for a while and the uptake's low. Would you speculate on why it's not taken off?
Some of the challenges. First thing, what I understood when I speak to many testers especially is like the testers are more focused on the end-to-end side of UI side of things, not on the API side of things. That mindset, first of all, should change. And when we are sitting within the team and, and of course now there are like a lot of improvements in the API functional side of testing, but they have to understand really what is that API contract means, what is consumer driven means, what is provider driven means. First of all, this understanding itself is a bit lacking. That is one challenge. The second challenge is because Pact is basically there for a long time and Pact predominantly supports consumer driven. And say as a provider, if I have 50 consumers, okay, and if the consumers are not ready to write the test, what will I do with my provider test, right? So both have to sort of work hand in hand. That is why I said if you are within the same organization, it could be better, easier for you to influence. Having said that, yes, we have our own challenges to influence as well, but that's where, all the agile and shifting left, all that comes into picture. So that is the another challenge. That's why, if you think consumer driven is not fitting well, you can see provider driven or bidirectional or any mix and match can suit. So you really have to see how your team dynamics are. How are you collaborating with your provider and consumer? Like what can, fit you really well? So you have to analyze that and choose based on that. Yeah. Yes, Anusha.
This was such a great presentation. Thank you. Now just a quick question. Are there any tips and tricks from your experience that has helped your option of contract testing and get the developer buy-in?
Sorry?
Are there any tips and tricks from your experience that has helped the organization about contract testing?
Yeah.
That has helped get developer buy-in as well?
Yeah, so for the developer buy-in, I really find because it is sitting at the unit test layer, more than a tester, developers are actually happy to write those test cases, okay? But I found bit resistant from the business side. Oh, when they have to write the test, oh, how much effort it will take, how much money it will take. But do you really think writing the unit test, like 10, 15, 20 years before, the unit test was like that, right? When we ask, oh, the unit test coverage is below, this was the same question raised that time. But now developers are actually happy to write the unit test. And because it is sitting within the code repository, they are much happier to do. I think it would be a bit difficult for the tester. If they are automation tester, they can really, I personally found more than writing the E2E Selenium automation, this is much easier. Okay, believe me. So you don't restrict yourself. Oh, this is something based on code base. I can't write nothing like that. It's just a simple JUnit test. It's a bit of learning curve. And as I said, yes, Pact is mostly on the more on the coding part, but attending Manoj's talks, right? He talked about the AI. Yeah. Yes, I'm talking about you. Yeah. So you stay here. Okay. Yeah. So he was saying like using AI to generate those test cases. So why can't we use AI to generate these consumer test cases? Because we are generating the test case based on the Swagger specification, based on the open API. So you have like a defined input here. So here actually custom LLM can, act really well to generate those test cases. So if your organization is supporting integrating with AI, we can very well say this can be really automated from the AI side of things as well. So yeah. Yeah.
Do you find this equally applies to both internal and external API testing?
Sorry?
Do you find this applies the same across the board for internal and external API testing?
Yeah, that's the types which I mentioned, right? So if it is internal, the consumer driven would fit in really well. If it is external, the provider driven approach fits in really well, or the bidirectional, because in those cases you are predominantly, checking against the provider contract, and provider is checking that. And as long as the consumer is expected to adhere and the consumer knows about that restriction, yes, it's well and good. Yeah. Okay, last 5 minutes. Let's go into the quiz. I actually wanted to do a live thing, but unfortunately, the Kahoot doesn't support more than 10 players for a free version. So I'm going to play like a solo player here and choose one of you to answer. Okay. Where is my... And remember, the gift is waiting. And I hope you focused. There are 5 questions. Okay, let's start. I'm just entering as host. It's only 20 seconds to answer. So whoever is raising the hand first, I'll go with them. Customers have very little influence with. Yes.
Provider driven.
Awesome.
Do I get the prize?
There are 5 questions. I said, let's see. The second question, bidirectional contract testing is the replacement for the Pact test. Third question, the consumer-driven contract testing, consumer writes the contract test using... Who told that first? You? Okay, I don't know whom to choose. I'm going to decide the question number just randomly, okay? And whoever is answering that question will get the prize. Fourth one, consumer-driven contract provider runs the consumer contract test against... Sorry?
Provider live.
That's you, Sanchari. Good listener.
Good friend.
Oh my God, then I can't give you a prize. Why did you say that? You missed your chance. Okay, fifth one. If I'm a public API provider, which testing approach suits me? Okay, it can be either the provider driven or bidirectional. Okay. Because he answered the first question, the prize. Yeah, I think that's it I have for today. Yeah, all the best and enjoy your rest of the time. Thank you. Bye.